Police slapped a 55-year-old grandmother in court. Seconds later, SHE took the judge's seat. In a small town nestled between bustling streets and quiet houses, a courthouse stood tall, a symbol of justice and order. Inside, the court was filled with a tense atmosphere as people from all walks of life gathered to seek answers, fairness, and truth. It was a typical day at the courthouse, except for one important case that was about to unfold. Margaret Evans, a 55-year-old grandmother, sat in the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been in trouble with the law before, and today she found herself tangled in a property dispute that had started as a simple misunderstanding. It was about a piece of land she and her family had owned for decades. Now, it was in the hands of a local developer who wanted to turn it into something entirely different. Margaret wasn't someone who took things lightly. She was known in her community for her strong spirit and sense of justice. As a mother and a grandmother, she had spent her life protecting her family, standing up for what was right, and fighting for fairness whenever she saw it. Today, she was ready to do the same. She wasn't going to let some developer take away what belonged to her family. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, reporters, and curious bystanders. Everyone's eyes were on Margaret as she began to speak, her voice firm but shaking slightly with the pressure. She explained how her family had lived on that land for generations, how her father had built their home with his own hands, and how the developer's plans threatened not only her property but also her family's history. But as she spoke, something unusual happened. The judge, a stern man in his 60s with thick glasses, seemed uninterested in her words. His eyes remained focused on the papers in front of him, and he barely acknowledged her as she spoke. Margaret tried again, making her case louder, more passionate, but still, the judge didn't seem to care. The room was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of papers or coughs from the audience. Margaret could feel the frustration bubbling up inside her. She had spent months preparing for this day, gathering documents and evidence, speaking with neighbors who supported her cause. And yet here she was being ignored. She wasn't going to let it slide. She raised her voice once more, trying to explain how important this case was for her family and for the community. Her words were filled with emotion as she spoke of her father's legacy and the memories that the land held for her. The judge, however, waved his hand dismissively and muttered, "Enough of this. We've heard enough." His voice was cold and final, dismissing her as if she were just another interruption in his busy day. Margaret's face reddened, her heart racing. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to cry in front of all these people. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. That's when the officer standing by the side of the courtroom took a step toward her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the typical uniform of a court officer. He had been watching Margaret closely as she spoke, and now, as she grew more upset, he seemed to think it was time to act. Without warning, the officer reached out and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her from her seat. Margaret gasped in surprise. She had never been touched like this before, let alone in front of a courtroom full of people. She looked around, hoping anyone would step in and stop what was happening. But the room remained eerily silent. The judge, still sitting at his bench, did nothing. He barely glanced up from his papers as if it were all part of the routine. The officer's grip tightened on her arm as he began to pull her away from the stand. Margaret struggled against him, her mind racing. She had come here to fight for her family's land, not to be treated like a criminal. She tried to break free, but the officer's hand was like a vice around her wrist. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she looked into the faces of the people around her. They were all watching, some with expressions of shock, others with disbelief. How could this be happening? Why wasn't anyone helping her? But then, in a moment that would forever change the course of her life, something inside Margaret snapped. She had had enough. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and standing up to those who used their power to crush the weak. She wasn't going to let anyone push her around. Not now, not ever. With a burst of energy, Margaret yanked her arm away from the officer's grip. She wasn't going to let him escort her out like some common criminal. Instead, she turned toward the judge's seat, her steps sure and determined. The officer, surprised by her sudden movement, hesitated for a moment, but Margaret didn't wait for him to react. She moved quickly with purpose toward the seat of power, the judge's seat. As she approached the bench, the room seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but no one made a move to stop her. She climbed the few steps up to the judge's seat, and without missing a beat, she sat down. The courtroom fell silent. No one could believe what they were seeing. There was a 55-year-old grandmother sitting in the judge's chair as if she owned the place. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The judge, now visibly shocked, looked at her from his own seat, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Margaret, however, remained calm. She knew she had made a bold statement, and now it was time to see if anyone would listen. The courtroom was stunned, but Margaret's courage spoke louder than any words could. She had taken control of the moment, seized the power that had been taken from her, and now she would make sure her voice was heard. No one could deny her anymore. The room was thick with tension. Margaret sat in the judge's chair, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy cloud. Her hands rested on the cold wooden armrests, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room burning into her. She didn't care. She had come here today to fight not just for her land, but for something much bigger. She had come to fight for dignity and respect, things that had been denied to her for far too long. The court was in shock. Everyone had seen her move quickly, confidently, and claim the judge's seat with no hesitation. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The officer who had grabbed her arm stood frozen, unsure whether to move or wait for orders. The other officers in the room remained silent, unsure if they should step in. They had never seen anything like this before. The judge, still in his seat, stared at Margaret with wide eyes, unsure of how to regain control. Margaret's heart raced, but her mind was clear. She knew this was a bold move, one that could have consequences. But in that moment, she didn't care about the consequences. She wasn't going to let anyone push her around anymore. She wasn't going to allow the system to continue treating her like she didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, she felt powerful. It wasn't just about her personal case anymore. It was about standing up to an entire system that had ignored people like her for years. Slowly, Margaret lifted her head, looking around the courtroom. She saw the faces of the spectators. Some were still in shock, some were whispering to each other, and some were nodding with approval. Margaret didn't need their approval, but it was clear that what she had done had struck a chord. She wasn't just fighting for her land. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, trying to regain control of the situation. "Madam," he said, his voice wavering slightly, "please return to your seat. This is highly inappropriate." But Margaret didn't move. Instead, she sat up straighter as if the chair gave her a newfound strength. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, looking the judge squarely in the eyes. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I will not return to my seat, not until I am treated with the respect I deserve." The room fell silent. It was as if no one knew what to expect next. Margaret's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She had spoken up, and now everyone in the room knew that this was no ordinary courtroom moment. This wasn't just a grandmother fighting for her property. This was someone standing up against injustice, someone who had had enough of being ignored and dismissed. The judge, still visibly flustered, opened his mouth to say something, but he didn't know what. He had spent his entire career as a judge, commanding respect in his courtroom. He had never been challenged in such a way, and yet here was Margaret, an older woman, sitting in his seat, staring him down as if she owned the place. He had no idea how to proceed. He couldn't just throw her out. There were people watching, and they were starting to see things differently. The court clerk, who had been standing by silently, now stepped forward, nervously asking, "Your Honor, what should we do?" The judge hesitated. His gaze shifted to the attorneys in the room, expecting them to help him regain control. But the attorneys remained silent. It wasn't that they didn't want to intervene. It was that they were too taken aback by Margaret's boldness. This was a moment they had never expected to witness in their careers. They were witnessing history unfold, and for a brief moment, they understood the gravity of what was happening. Margaret looked over at the crowd, her heart still racing but her voice steady. "I'm not here to break the law," she continued. "I am here to demand fairness. You have heard my case, but I have been ignored, silenced, and treated like nothing more than a nuisance. I deserve more than this." Her words resonated, each one landing with weight as she spoke of the inequality she had felt her entire life. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. The officer who had grabbed her earlier still stood near the door, his hand hovering near his radio, unsure whether to call for backup or simply wait for the judge's instructions. Margaret could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he wasn't sure how to de-escalate it either. Margaret, however, wasn't backing down. "I will not be silenced anymore," she said firmly. "The system has let me down, but I won't let it break me." Her words struck a chord with the people in the courtroom. Many of them were ordinary citizens, just like Margaret, and they had seen how the system often worked against them. They knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be ignored, to have their voices go unheard. Margaret's courage in that moment gave them a voice they had longed for but hadn't known how to express. The judge, now realizing that he had lost control of the room, stood up slowly. He didn't know what to say to Margaret, but he knew he couldn't let this continue. His authority was being challenged in a way he had never experienced before. "You need to leave this courtroom immediately," he finally said, his voice shaking with uncertainty. But Margaret remained firm, refusing to give in. "I will leave when I am ready," she said. "But not until this case is heard fairly, and not until I am treated with the respect I deserve." For a moment, it seemed as if the room would explode with tension. The officer stepped forward again, this time with more force, but Margaret didn't flinch. Her eyes remained steady, focused on the task at hand. The judge, realizing he had no choice but to regain control, called for a recess. "This court will take a break," he said, his voice still trembling. "We will reconvene shortly." The courtroom was filled with whispers and murmurs as people began to file out. Margaret remained in the judge's seat, her back straight and her eyes forward. She hadn't won yet, but in that moment, she felt like she had accomplished something huge. She had made a statement that couldn't be ignored. She had taken back her power, and nothing could take that away from her. The room slowly began to quiet, and the courthouse was filled with an energy that hadn't been present before. Margaret still sat in the judge's seat, her hands resting on the cold, smooth wood. It was as if time had stopped. For a few moments, everyone in the courtroom was in a daze, unsure of what to do next. The judge had called for a recess, but the tension was still thick in the air. The officers, the lawyers, even the spectators all stood motionless, as if waiting for something to happen. Margaret, however, wasn't waiting for anything. She had already made her move. She had shown everyone in that room that she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself and that she was done being ignored. But as she sat there, her heart was racing with adrenaline. She knew that what she had done was bold, maybe even reckless. But she also knew that sometimes, to be heard, you had to break the rules to disrupt the status quo. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or wronged by the system. As the minutes passed, the courtroom slowly started to come back to life. Some of the spectators whispered to each other, some in disbelief, others in admiration. Margaret could hear fragments of their conversations, but she didn't pay attention to them. Her focus was on the case at hand, the reason she had come here today. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Finally, the judge, looking flustered and unsure, returned to the bench. He sat down slowly, adjusting his glasses, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. He cleared his throat and looked over at Margaret, who was still sitting in his seat, calm and composed. The sight of her in that chair, a grandmother who had clearly been through so much in her life, sent a message that he couldn't ignore. "Madam," the judge began, his voice shaking slightly, "this behavior is completely unacceptable. You cannot simply take the seat of the judge. I am giving you one more chance to leave peacefully." But Margaret wasn't intimidated. She had heard enough of the judge's commands to know that they were meant to silence her, to make her feel small. She wasn't going to back down now. "I didn't take your seat to disrespect you," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I took it because I am tired of being treated like I don't matter. I took it because I want to be heard." The room was silent again. It wasn't just her words that made the room still, it was the truth in them. Everyone could see that Margaret wasn't just fighting for her land, but for something much bigger. She was fighting for her dignity. She was fighting for the dignity of everyone who had been dismissed by the system. "I understand that what I did is unusual," Margaret continued, her gaze never leaving the judge. "But what's even more unusual is how I've been treated. I have spent years watching people like me, people with no power, struggle against a system that always seems to favor the wealthy and the well-connected. And I've had enough." The judge, still trying to regain control, stared at her for a moment before finally speaking. You can't just disrupt the courtroom, you have to follow the rules. This is a court of law, not a stage for protest. Margaret's expression softened, but her voice was still firm. This isn't a protest, she said. This is a plea for justice. I'm not trying to make a scene for the sake of it. I'm trying to make sure people like me, people who have worked their whole lives and built something meaningful, are treated fairly. I'm asking for what's right. The judge paused, his mind clearly conflicted. He had dealt with hundreds of cases in his career, but none like this. He had seen people challenge his authority before, but never in this way. Never with such resolve, never with such truth. His eyes flicked around the room, and for the first time he saw the faces of the people in the gallery, all watching him, all waiting to see how he would respond. Margaret had done something remarkable in that moment. She had shifted the balance of power. She had taken control of the room, not through force, but through her words, through her courage. She had spoken the truth that no one else was willing to say. And now the judge was faced with the truth, and he didn't know how to handle it. The courtroom remained silent for a long while, and Margaret could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She didn't mind the silence. In fact, it felt good to be heard. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her voice mattered. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke, his voice softer than before. This court will continue its session in a moment, but I want you to understand something, Mrs. Evans, he said, his tone shifting. I can't allow this kind of behavior to go unpunished. You'll be held accountable for disrupting the proceedings. Margaret didn't flinch. I'm ready to face whatever comes next, she said, but I'll never stop fighting for what's right. There was a pause, and for a brief moment it seemed like the judge might respond harshly. But instead he nodded slowly. Very well, he said before turning to the court clerk. Proceed with the next case. We'll deal with Mrs. Evans' actions afterward. As the clerk called the next case, Margaret stood up from the judge's seat. The officer, still unsure of what to do, remained still, his hand hovering near his radio. Margaret looked at him, and for a moment their eyes locked. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of anyone in that courtroom. She had taken a stand, and she wasn't backing down. As she walked out of the courtroom, she could feel the eyes of the spectators on her. Some of them were still shocked, but others looked at her with a new sense of respect. Margaret had done something no one else in that room had the courage to do. She had fought back. She had shown everyone that you didn't have to be powerful or wealthy to demand respect. You just had to be brave enough to stand up for what was right. Margaret walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and for a brief moment she was alone in the hallway. Her heart was still racing from the events that had just unfolded, but there was a quiet sense of pride deep within her. She hadn't planned for this moment. She hadn't expected to make such a bold move, but now that she had, she couldn't help but feel like she had done something important, something that might make a difference. As she stood there in the hallway, her mind replayed the scene in the courtroom. She could still hear the judge's voice, the shock in his words as he tried to regain control. And she could still see the faces of the people in the room, their surprise, their disbelief, and some, she noticed, even admiration. Margaret had never thought of herself as a fighter. She was just a grandmother trying to protect her family's land. But in that moment, she had become something more, a symbol of defiance against a system that had failed her and so many others. She walked down the hallway toward the exit, her footsteps steady. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she wasn't afraid. Whatever came, she knew she had done the right thing. She had spoken up when no one else would. She had shown the world that sometimes the smallest voices could make the biggest impact. As she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, she was greeted by the hustle and bustle of the courthouse plaza. People were moving quickly, some heading to their cars, others rushing to their next appointments. But for Margaret, everything felt different now. The weight of the courtroom had been left behind, and she was standing in a world that suddenly felt a little bit more open to her. She had made her mark, and she knew that people were talking about her. Her son, Robert, who had been waiting for her outside, approached quickly. His face was full of concern, but there was also a spark of pride in his eyes. He had seen the way his mother had taken control of the courtroom, and it filled him with a sense of respect he hadn't fully understood before. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Margaret smiled softly. "I'm fine, Robert, just a little tired, I suppose." "I can't believe what you did in there," he said, shaking his head. "That was incredible," Margaret chuckled. "I didn't plan for any of that to happen, it just felt right." Robert looked at her, still in awe. It was more than right. You stood up for yourself and for everyone who's ever been silenced. Margaret's smile faded slightly as she thought about the years she had spent feeling like her voice didn't matter. She had always tried to do what was right, but the world had a way of dismissing people like her, people without wealth or influence. But today, in that courtroom, she had taken her power back, and for the first time she felt like her voice had been heard. The moment passed, and the reality of the situation began to set in. Margaret knew there would be consequences for what she had done. She had disrupted the court, and she would likely face some form of punishment. But she didn't regret it, not for a second. In fact, she felt more alive than she had in years. As they walked to the car, Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a flood of messages and missed calls. The media had already caught wind of what had happened in the courtroom. News outlets had begun reporting on the shocking incident, and social media was buzzing with reactions. Some people were outraged by what they saw as a disrespectful act, while others, many others, were praising Margaret for her bravery. Her phone continued to buzz as they drove home. The messages were pouring in, some from friends and family, others from people she didn't even know. The support was overwhelming. Margaret had become a symbol of resistance, of courage, and of standing up for what was right. She never expected any of this, but now it was clear that her actions had sparked something much larger than she could have imagined. That evening, as the sun began to set, Margaret sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. Robert was at the stove making dinner, and the house was filled with the comforting sounds of everyday life. But inside, Margaret was thinking about what had happened and what might still happen. She had taken a stand in the courtroom, but that was only the beginning. The system had failed her, and it had failed so many others like her. She knew that, even if she faced consequences, she couldn't stop now. She had sparked a conversation, and now it was time to make sure that conversation continued. The next day, Margaret called a press conference. It was a bold move, one that she hadn't planned for when she first sat in that judge's seat, but it felt like the right step. She knew that if she didn't speak out, if she didn't continue to demand fairness, everything she had done would lose its impact. She needed to be heard again. At the press conference, Margaret stood tall behind the podium, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. She wasn't nervous. She had already faced the most intense moment of her life. Now she was ready to share her message with the world. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Yesterday, I took a stand for myself and my family. But I also took a stand for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who has been silenced by a system that doesn't care about them. Yesterday wasn't just about my case. It was about making sure that our voices are heard, that we are treated with respect." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. The room was silent, every reporter hanging on to her every word. "I don't know what will happen next," she continued, "but I do know this: I won't back down. I won't let the system continue to silence people like me. And I won't let them silence anyone else. It's time for change, and I'll keep fighting for it." The room erupted into applause, and Margaret felt a swell of pride. She had done it. She had turned a moment of frustration and anger into something powerful. She had used her voice to make a difference. As the press conference ended and Margaret walked out into the bright sunlight, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew that her fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. But in that moment, she understood something important. She had the power to create change, and nothing could take that away from her. The days following Margaret's bold act in the courtroom passed in a blur. The attention from the press and the public was overwhelming, but in some ways it also felt surreal. Margaret never expected to be at the center of such a storm. She had only intended to stand up for herself, to ensure her voice was heard. But now her story was spreading far and wide. People everywhere were talking about the grandmother who had taken control of a courtroom and made a judge, a room full of lawyers, and the entire court system listened to her. At first, Margaret wasn't sure how to handle all the attention. She had never sought fame or recognition. She was just a woman who wanted to protect what was hers, to make sure her family's land stayed in their hands. But as the days went by, Margaret began to realize the importance of what she had done, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. She had started a conversation about power, fairness, and the rights of ordinary people. As the weeks went on, the case that had brought Margaret to court was reopened. The local community, which had once been quiet and divided on issues like this, began to rally behind her. People who had heard her story came forward to support her, and others who had never met her started to write letters, sign petitions, and speak out in her favor. Margaret's actions had sparked something bigger than herself. It had inspired people to stand up for what they believed in, to question authority, and to demand fairness. One day, a lawyer who had been following Margaret's story reached out to her. He introduced himself as Thomas Reynolds, a civil rights attorney known for fighting cases where ordinary citizens were up against powerful institutions. He had seen the footage of Margaret's stand in the courtroom, and he believed that her case could be more than just a personal battle. It could be a landmark case that challenged how the legal system treated people like her. "We want to help," Thomas said during their meeting. "What you did was extraordinary, Margaret, but it's not just about one woman standing up to a judge. It's about the way the system treats people who don't have power. We want to take your case to the next level." Margaret listened carefully, her mind racing. She wasn't sure she was ready for such a big step, but the thought of fighting for real change, of making sure that her stand in the courtroom meant something, was tempting. She had already gone this far. Maybe this was her chance to help others, to ensure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else again. She thought about the years of struggles she had faced in her life, the times when she had been overlooked, dismissed, or ignored. She thought about the many people who had come to her after hearing her story, telling her how they had faced similar treatment. Margaret realized that this wasn't just about land or property. It was about standing up to a system that didn't always treat people fairly. It was about making sure that no one else would ever feel as small and powerless as she had before. With a deep breath, Margaret agreed. She and Thomas discussed the plan. They would file a lawsuit against the courthouse, challenging the way the system had handled her case. They would demand justice, not just for Margaret, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the legal system. It was a long shot, but Margaret was ready to take it. Meanwhile, the media continued to follow the case closely. News outlets picked up her story, and soon, Margaret was invited to speak at rallies and forums across the country. People from all walks of life reached out to her, offering their support. She became a symbol of resistance, of courage in the face of injustice. Margaret had become a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless, for those who believed that their voices didn't matter. But despite the growing attention, Margaret stayed grounded. She never let the publicity distract her from the real reason she had started this fight: to bring about change. Every interview, every public appearance was an opportunity to speak out about the issues that mattered most to her. She wasn't interested in being a celebrity or becoming famous. She was interested in making a difference. The court case that followed was long and difficult. Margaret and Thomas faced many obstacles, including pushback from powerful figures in the legal system who didn't want to see things change. But Margaret's determination never wavered. She was relentless, and so was her team. The case went through many twists and turns, but eventually it gained the attention of the highest courts in the land. Months later, after a long and exhausting battle, the court finally ruled in Margaret's favor. The judge acknowledged that the system had failed her and many others like her. The ruling wasn't just a win for Margaret. It was a win for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. The case set a precedent, establishing new standards for how the legal system would handle similar cases in the future. It was a turning point. Margaret couldn't believe it. She had fought for so long, and now, finally, the system had listened. She had shown the world that one person could make a difference, that courage and determination could break down even the strongest barriers. The victory was bittersweet, though. Margaret had lost so much along the way: her peace, her comfort, her sense of normalcy. But in the end, she had gained something far greater: justice. In the years that followed, Margaret continued to fight for what she believed in. She spoke at schools, inspiring young people to stand up for themselves and their communities. She worked with organizations that promoted fairness and equality, making sure that the changes she had fought for were implemented in real, tangible ways. She never stopped being an advocate for justice, never stopped demanding better from the system. Her life had changed in ways she never expected. She had gone from a quiet, determined woman trying to protect her family's land to a symbol of hope for millions of people. Margaret had faced down the powerful forces of the legal system, and she had won. But more than that, she had shown the world that no one, no matter how small or powerless they seemed, was ever truly alone. Margaret Evans had started a revolution, not with violence or anger, but with courage, conviction, and a refusal to be ignored. And in doing so, she had inspired others to follow in her footsteps, to stand up for what was right, and to never, ever let the system keep them quiet.